The morning fog hung low over the ancient stone walls of Kensington Palace like a grey blanket that refused to lift. It was the kind of morning where the cold crept into your bones no matter how many layers you wore, and the sky looked like someone had painted it with nothing but shades of sadness. The year was 1997, and London was a city that never truly slept, but on this particular Tuesday in late November, even the pigeons seemed reluctant to leave their roosts. The trees in the palace gardens had already shed most of their leaves, and the groundskeepers had given up trying to rake them all because the wind kept bringing more down with every gust. It was in this grey, damp and thoroughly miserable setting that a man named Thomas Hartfield began his morning shift as a royal guard at one of the most famous residences in all of England. Thomas was not the kind of man who attracted attention. He was of average height with a face that people often described as forgettable, which was actually a quality that served him rather well in his line of work. He had been a royal guard for nearly 14 years, having joined the service when he was just 23 years old, fresh out of the military, and looking for something that would give his life a sense of purpose and structure. His father had been a factory worker in Birmingham, and his mother had cleaned houses for wealthy families in the nicer parts of town. Thomas had grown up watching his parents work themselves to the bone for very little reward, and he had promised himself from a young age that he would find a career that offered him dignity, even if it did not offer him riches. The Royal Guard service had given him exactly that. He wore his uniform with pride, stood at his post without complaint even in the worst weather, and carried out his duties with a quiet professionalism that his superiors had come to appreciate over the years. On this particular morning, Thomas arrived at the palace gates at precisely 5:45, which was 15 minutes earlier than required. He always arrived early because he believed that punctuality was not just a habit, but a reflection of a person's character. He nodded to the night guard, a younger man named Davies, who always looked like he had not slept in days, and took his position near the East Wing entrance. The East Wing was not the most glamorous part of the palace, and it certainly did not get the attention that the main entrance received from tourists and photographers, but Thomas did not mind. He had learned long ago that the quiet corners of grand places often held the most interesting secrets, and the East Wing was no exception to that rule. The East Wing of Kensington Palace had a history that stretched back centuries, and over the years it had served many different purposes. At various times it had been used as a storage area, a servants' quarters, a temporary hospital during wartime, and even, according to palace legend, a hiding place for members of the royal family during periods of political unrest. The walls were thick stone, the corridors were narrow and poorly lit, and there was a dampness to the air that no amount of modern heating seemed able to cure. Beneath the East Wing there was a series of cellars that had been built in the 17th century and had been used for everything from storing wine to housing prisoners. Most of these cellars had been sealed off decades ago, their entrances bricked up or hidden behind heavy wooden doors that were locked and forgotten. But Thomas knew about them. He knew about them because he was the kind of man who paid attention to things that other people overlooked, and because he had spent 14 years walking these corridors and noticing every crack, every draft, and every door that seemed to lead nowhere. It was around 7:30 in the morning when Thomas first noticed that something was not quite right. He had completed his initial patrol of the East Wing perimeter and was walking back toward his post when he saw a door that he had never seen open before, standing slightly ajar. The door was located at the far end of a corridor that was rarely used, tucked between a storage cupboard and an old radiator that had not worked in years. It was a heavy wooden door, dark with age, and it had always been locked for as long as Thomas could remember. But now it was open, just a crack, just enough for a thin sliver of darkness to peek through from whatever lay beyond it. Thomas stopped walking and stared at the door for a long moment. His training told him that anything unusual needed to be investigated, reported, and documented. His instinct, which was something quite different from training, told him that this door had been opened for a reason, and that the reason was probably not a good one. Thomas approached the door carefully, his footsteps echoing softly on the stone floor. He reached out and pushed it open a few more inches, and immediately a rush of cold, damp air hit him in the face. It smelled like earth and stone and something else, something older and more difficult to identify. Behind the door, there was a narrow staircase leading downward into darkness. The stairs were made of the same stone as the walls, worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, and they disappeared into a blackness that seemed almost solid. Thomas pulled out his flashlight, the standard issue one that every guard carried, and shone it down the staircase. The beam of light cut through the darkness like a knife, revealing rough stone walls stained with moisture and a ceiling so low that Thomas would need to duck his head to avoid hitting it. He knew he should call it in. Protocol was clear about situations like this. If a guard discovered something unusual, They were supposed to report it immediately to their supervisor and wait for further instructions. But Thomas also knew that calling it in would mean paperwork and questions and probably a team of people tramping down those stairs and disturbing whatever was down there before he had a chance to understand what he was looking at. And Thomas was curious. He had always been curious, ever since he was a boy growing up in Birmingham, poking around in abandoned buildings and climbing over fences to explore places he was not supposed to go. That curiosity had gotten him into trouble more than once as a child, but it had also made him a better guard because he noticed things that others missed, and he asked questions that others did not think to ask. So Thomas made a decision that would change the course of his life and the lives of several other people in ways that none of them could have predicted. He stepped through the door and began to descend the narrow staircase, his flashlight in one hand and his other hand pressed against the cold, wet wall for balance. The stairs were steep and uneven, and with each step downward, the air grew colder and damper. He counted the steps as he went, a habit from his military days. And by the time he reached the bottom, he had counted 37 steps down into the belly of a palace that had stood for hundreds of years, and Thomas felt as though he had stepped back in time. At the bottom of the stairs there was a short corridor that opened into a small chamber. The chamber was roughly rectangular, perhaps 15 feet long and 10 feet wide, with a ceiling that was just high enough for Thomas to stand upright if he did not raise his head too much. The walls were bare stone, dark with damp, and the floor was covered with a thin layer of dust and debris that suggested no one had been down here in a very long time. But that could not be entirely true, because someone had opened that door upstairs, and someone had been down here recently enough to leave behind what Thomas now saw in the beam of his flashlight. In the far corner of the chamber, sitting on the damp stone floor like a discarded toy, was a small velvet bag. It was dark blue, the kind of deep, rich blue that Thomas associated with expensive things, and it was tied at the top with a thin gold cord. The bag was small enough to fit in the palm of his hand, and even from across the chamber, Thomas could see that it was wet. The dampness of the cellar had soaked into the velvet, darkening it in patches and making it look like it had been down here for some time. But the bag itself did not look old. It looked like something that had been placed here deliberately, something that someone had wanted to hide in a place where no one would think to look. Thomas crossed the chamber slowly, his eyes scanning the floor for any other signs of disturbance. The dust on the floor showed faint marks, the kind of scuff marks that shoes would leave, but they were not clear enough to make out individual footprints. Whoever had been down here had either been very careful or the dampness had partially erased their tracks. Thomas knelt down beside the velvet bag and stared at it for a long moment before reaching out and picking it up. It was heavier than he expected for something so small, and through the wet velvet he could feel the hard outlines of whatever was inside. He held the bag up to his flashlight and turned it over in his hands, looking for any identifying marks or labels. There were none. Just a plain blue velvet bag with a gold cord, sitting in a damp cellar beneath a royal palace, waiting for someone to find it. Thomas knew that he should not open the bag. Every part of his training screamed at him to put it down, go back upstairs, and report what he had found. But that curiosity, that relentless, burning curiosity that had been with him since childhood, was too strong to ignore. He loosened the gold cord and opened the mouth of the bag, tilting it so that the contents slid out into his open palm. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat and his heart begin to beat faster in his chest. It was a bracelet. But not just any bracelet. It was a piece of jewelry so exquisite, so clearly valuable, that Thomas immediately understood why someone had hidden it in a place like this. The bracelet was made of gold, delicate and intricate, with a pattern of interlocking links that looked like tiny flowers woven together by a master craftsman. Set into the gold were small stones that caught the light of his flashlight and threw tiny sparks of color across the walls of the chamber. Some of the stones were blue, some were white, and some had a pinkish hue that Thomas could not quite identify, but that he found incredibly beautiful. The bracelet was clearly old, not ancient but old enough to have a history, and it had a quality to it that Thomas had only ever seen in the kind of jewelry that was displayed in museum cases with thick glass and security cameras watching from every angle. But the bracelet was also broken. One of the links in the chain had snapped, leaving a gap in the otherwise perfect circle. And near the clasp there was a small engraving that Thomas had to squint to read in the dim light of his flashlight. He brought the bracelet closer to his eyes and tilted it until the light caught the engraving just right. The letters were tiny and elegant, written in a flowing script that looked like it had been done by hand rather than by machine. Thomas read the engraving once, then twice, then a third time, each reading making his heart beat a little faster, and his hands trembled a little more. The engraving read simply and unmistakably. It said Charlotte. Just that. One word. That one name. Engraved in gold on a bracelet that had been hidden in a damp cellar beneath a royal palace. Charlotte. Thomas sat back on his heels and stared at the bracelet in his hand, his mind racing through everything he knew about the palace, its history, and the people who had lived within its walls. Charlotte was not an uncommon name, of course. There had been many Charlottes throughout history, and several of them had connections to the British royal family. But Thomas had a feeling, a deep and unshakable feeling in the pit of his stomach, that this bracelet belonged to one Charlotte in particular, and that its presence in this cellar was not an accident, but a clue to something much larger and much more troubling than a piece of lost jewelry. Thomas carefully placed the bracelet back in the velvet bag and pulled the gold cord tight. He stood up, his knees aching from kneeling on the cold stone floor, and took one last look around the chamber. The walls stared back at him blankly, offering no answers and no explanations. The dust on the floor kept its secrets, and the dampness continued its slow, patient work of reclaiming the stone for nature. Thomas turned and walked back to the staircase, climbing the 37 steps with the velvet bag tucked securely in his pocket. When he reached the top, he pushed the door closed behind him and stood in the corridor, breathing hard, his mind still trying to process what he had found. He knew now that he had to report this, and he knew that when he did, things would start moving very quickly in directions that he could not control. But before he called his supervisor, Thomas did something that was both instinctive and, as it would turn out, incredibly important. He pulled out his small personal notebook, the one he always carried in his breast pocket, and he wrote down everything he had seen. The door, the staircase, the chamber, the velvet bag, the bracelet, the broken link, and the engraving. He wrote it all down in his neat, careful handwriting, noting the time and date and the exact location of each detail. He did this because he was a man who believed in records, in evidence, in the power of written words to preserve truth in a world that was constantly trying to distort it. When he was finished writing, Thomas closed his notebook and tucked it back into his pocket alongside the velvet bag. He took a deep breath, straightened his uniform, and walked to the security office to make his report. As he walked, he passed a window that looked out over the palace gardens, and he noticed that the fog had begun to lift. Thin shafts of pale sunlight were breaking through the grey clouds, illuminating patches of the wet lawn and making the remaining leaves on the trees glow with a faint golden light. It was, Thomas thought, as if the world itself knew that something important had just happened and was slowly, reluctantly, beginning to reveal itself. The security office was a small, cramped room on the ground floor of the East Wing, filled with monitors, radio equipment, and the ever-present smell of stale coffee. Thomas's supervisor, a man named Sergeant William Crawford, was sitting at his desk when Thomas arrived. Crawford was a large man with a thick neck and small, sharp eyes that missed very little. He had been in the security service for over 20 years and had seen just about everything that palace life could throw at a person. He looked up when Thomas entered, his expression the same neutral mask that he wore at all times, and waited for Thomas to speak. Thomas told Crawford about the door, the staircase, and the chamber. He told him about the velvet bag and its contents. He described the bracelet in detail, including the broken link and the engraving that read, Charlotte. Throughout all of this, Crawford listened without interrupting, his small eyes fixed on Thomas's face as if he were trying to read something there that went beyond the words being spoken. When Thomas finished, Crawford was silent for a long moment. Then he leaned back in his chair, the old springs creaking under his weight, and let out a long, slow breath through his nose. Crawford asked Thomas if anyone else had seen what he had found. Thomas said no, he had been alone. Crawford asked if Thomas had touched anything in the chamber besides the bag. Thomas said he had not. Crawford asked if Thomas had told anyone else about his discovery. Thomas said he had come straight to Crawford because that was protocol, and because he trusted Crawford to know what to do with this kind of information. Crawford nodded slowly at this, and Thomas thought he saw something in the older man's eyes that might have been approval, though with Crawford, it was always difficult to tell. Crawford stood up from his desk and walked to the door of the security office. He looked out into the corridor, checking to see if anyone was within earshot, and then closed the door and locked it. He turned back to Thomas and spoke in a low, measured voice that carried the weight of someone who understood the gravity of what he was about to say. Crawford told Thomas that the bracelet he had found was almost certainly a piece that had been reported missing from the royal collection nearly 3 years earlier. He said that the disappearance of the bracelet had caused a significant amount of concern within the palace security apparatus, but that the matter had been handled quietly to avoid public attention and media speculation. He said that several people had been questioned about the bracelet's disappearance, but no one had been able to provide any satisfactory explanation for how it had vanished or where it might have gone. Thomas listened to all of this with a growing sense of unease. He had expected his discovery to be significant, but he had not expected it to be connected to something that had apparently been a source of worry at the highest levels of palace security. He asked Crawford who Charlotte was, the Charlotte whose name was engraved on the bracelet. Crawford looked at Thomas for a long time before answering, and when he did answer, his voice was even quieter than before, barely above a whisper. He said that the bracelet had belonged to a woman named Charlotte Ashworth, and that Charlotte Ashworth had been, until her sudden and unexplained departure from palace service 3 years ago, one of the most trusted members of the royal household staff. The name Charlotte Ashworth meant nothing to Thomas at that moment, but over the coming days and weeks it would come to mean a great deal. Charlotte Ashworth was a woman who had worked within the inner circles of the palace for nearly a decade, a woman who had been privy to secrets and schedules and private moments that very few people outside the royal family ever got to see. She had been, by all accounts, an exemplary member of staff, professional, discreet, and devoted to her duties. And then one day, without warning and without explanation, she had simply disappeared. Not disappeared in the dramatic sense of a missing persons case, but disappeared in the quiet, unsettling way that people sometimes do when they know something that powerful people do not want known. She had handed in her resignation, packed her belongings, and left the palace without saying goodbye to anyone. No forwarding address, no phone number, no way to contact her. She had simply walked out of the gates and vanished into the vast, anonymous landscape of ordinary life. Crawford told Thomas that the disappearance of Charlotte Ashworth had troubled him for years. He said that in his experience, people did not simply walk away from positions of trust and privilege without a reason, and the fact that Charlotte had left behind a valuable piece of personal jewelry suggested that her departure had been more sudden and more distressing than anyone had realized at the time. Crawford said that when the bracelet was first reported missing, the assumption had been that Charlotte had taken it with her, perhaps as a keepsake, or perhaps because she had felt entitled to it after years of faithful service. But now, with the bracelet turning up in a sealed cellar beneath the east wing, that assumption no longer held. If Charlotte had left the bracelet behind, hidden in a place where it was clearly not meant to be found, then there had to be a reason. And Crawford wanted to know what that reason was. Thomas stood in the security office, the velvet bag heavy in his pocket and 1,000 questions racing through his mind. He could feel that he had stumbled onto the edge of something much bigger than a lost bracelet, something that involved people and events and decisions that were far above his pay grade. But he also felt something else, something that surprised him with its intensity. He felt a sense of responsibility. He had found the bracelet. He had been the one to descend those 37 steps into the darkness and bring this piece of evidence back into the light. And now, whether he wanted it or not, he was part of whatever story this bracelet had to tell. Crawford asked Thomas to hand over the bracelet, and Thomas reached into his pocket and placed the velvet bag on Crawford's desk. Crawford opened the bag and examined the bracelet just as Thomas had done, turning it over in his thick fingers and squinting at the engraving. Then he placed the bracelet back in the bag and locked it in the top drawer of his desk. He told Thomas that from this point forward, this matter was to be treated with the utmost confidentiality. Thomas was not to discuss his discovery with anyone, not his fellow guards, not his friends, not his family. Crawford said that he would be making some inquiries of his own, and that he would keep Thomas informed of any developments. But until then, Thomas was to go about his duties as if nothing had happened. Thomas agreed, because agreeing was what you did when your supervisor gave you a direct instruction. But as he left the security office and walked back to his post in the East Wing corridor, he knew that something had fundamentally changed. The palace looked the same as it always did, with its grand architecture and its manicured gardens and its air of timeless dignity. But Thomas now saw it differently. He saw it as a place with secrets buried deep beneath its foundations, secrets that someone had gone to great lengths to hide. And he had a feeling that grew stronger with every passing hour, that the story of Charlotte Ashworth and her broken bracelet was only just beginning to unfold. The fog outside had cleared completely now, and the November sun was shining with a pale, cold light that made everything look sharp and clear. Thomas took up his position by the East Wing entrance, straightened his shoulders, and waited. He did not know what would happen next, but he knew that he would be ready for it when it came. The days that followed Thomas Hartfield's discovery in the cellar were unlike anything he had experienced in his 14 years of service at Kensington Palace. On the surface, his routine remained exactly the same. He arrived early for his shifts, stood at his post with the same quiet discipline that had defined his career, and exchanged polite nods with his fellow guards as they passed each other in the corridors. But beneath that surface, everything had shifted. Thomas carried the knowledge of what he had found like an invisible weight on his shoulders, and every time he walked past that particular stretch of corridor in the east wing, his eyes would drift toward the heavy wooden door that had been standing open that morning, now firmly shut and, he assumed, locked once again by Sergeant Crawford. Crawford, for his part, had been uncharacteristically quiet since the morning of the discovery. Thomas had expected to be called into the security office within a day or two for an update, but 3 days passed, then 4, then 5, and Crawford said nothing. When Thomas saw him in the corridors or the staff canteen, Crawford gave no indication that anything unusual had occurred between them. He ate his meals with the same methodical chewing that he always did, drank his tea from the same chipped mug with the faded regimental crest on the side, and talked to the other security staff about the same mundane topics that filled every working day at the palace. Football results, weather forecasts, and complaints about the new parking regulations that the council had imposed on the streets surrounding the palace grounds. If Thomas had not been standing in Crawford's office just days earlier, watching the man lock a broken gold bracelet in his desk drawer with an expression that suggested the weight of the world had just been placed upon him, he might have believed that nothing had happened at all. But Thomas was not the kind of man who forgot things easily, and he was certainly not the kind of man who could let a mystery sit unsolved in the back of his mind without poking at it. On the 6th day after his discovery, Thomas decided that he could not wait any longer. He needed to know more about Charlotte Ashworth, and since Crawford was not forthcoming with information, Thomas would have to find it himself. This was not something that came naturally to him. Thomas was a guard, not an investigator. His job was to watch, to protect, and to report, not to dig into the personal histories of former palace staff members. But the bracelet had changed something in him, had awakened a part of his mind that refused to rest until it had answers. And so, after his shift ended on that 6th day, instead of going home to his small flat in Shepherd's Bush, Thomas went to the public library in Kensington High Street. The library was a grand old building with tall windows and the kind of hushed atmosphere that Thomas had always found comforting. He had never been a great reader as a child, but the military had taught him the value of research, and over the years he had developed a habit of visiting libraries when he needed to understand something that was beyond his immediate experience. He sat down at one of the long wooden tables, pulled a stack of newspapers toward him, and began to search for any mention of Charlotte Ashworth. He did not know exactly what he was looking for, but he trusted that he would recognize it when he found it. It took him nearly 2 hours of flipping through microfilm archives and old newspaper clippings before he found anything at all. The first mention of Charlotte Ashworth was a small article in a society magazine from 1991, which described her as a new addition to the household staff at Kensington Palace. The article was brief and largely flattering, noting that Charlotte came from a respectable family in Dorset, that she had been educated at a private school in Hampshire, and that she had previously worked for a well-known aristocratic family in the home counties before being recruited to the palace. There was a photograph accompanying the article, a black and white image of a young woman with dark hair pulled back from her face, high cheekbones, and an expression that Thomas could only describe as guardedly intelligent. She looked like someone who was paying very close attention to everything around her, but who had learned to hide that attention behind a mask of polite composure. Thomas stared at the photograph for a long time, trying to reconcile the image of this composed, attractive young woman with the story that Crawford had told him about her sudden and mysterious departure from the palace. People who looked like this, who carried themselves with this kind of quiet confidence, did not simply vanish from their lives without leaving a trace. Something had happened to Charlotte Ashworth, something that had frightened her badly enough to make her abandon not just her job, but her bracelet, a piece of jewelry that was clearly of great personal and monetary value. Thomas made a mental note of the details in the article and continued his search. Over the next hour, he found 3 more references to Charlotte Ashworth in various publications. The second was a mention in a gossip column from 1993 which noted that she had been seen at a charity event at the palace in the company of several senior members of the household staff. The third was another brief mention in a trade publication for domestic service professionals, which listed her as having received a commendation for outstanding service to the royal household. The fourth, and by far the most interesting, was an article from a local newspaper in Dorset, dated 1994, which reported that Charlotte's mother, a woman named Eleanor Ashworth, had died unexpectedly at the age of 62. The article noted that Charlotte had returned to Dorset for the funeral, but had declined to make any public statement about her mother's death. Thomas sat back in his chair and considered what he had learned. The picture that was emerging was one of a woman who had been successful, respected, and connected. a woman who had built a career within one of the most prestigious institutions in the country, and who had done so with skill and discretion. But there was something else there too, something that Thomas could feel rather than see. There was a loneliness to Charlotte Ashworth's story, a sense of a woman who was always slightly apart from the world around her. The photograph showed a woman who smiled, but whose eyes did not quite match the curve of her lips. The articles described a woman who was present at events but who never seemed to be the focus of them. She was always in the background, always watching, always doing her job with a perfection that was almost too perfect, as if she were trying to be invisible while standing in plain sight. Thomas left the library as it was closing, stepping out into the cold evening air with his mind buzzing with questions and theories. He walked slowly through the streets of Kensington, barely noticing the people around him or the cars splashing through puddles left by an earlier rain shower. He was thinking about Charlotte Ashworth and her broken bracelet, about the damp cellar beneath the east wing, and about why a woman who had apparently been so careful and controlled would leave behind something so personal in a place so hidden. It did not make sense, and the more Thomas thought about it, the less sense it made. Unless, of course, Charlotte had not left the bracelet behind voluntarily. Unless someone else had put it there, either after taking it from Charlotte or after finding it somewhere that Charlotte had dropped it. That possibility opened up an entirely new set of questions, and Thomas felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the November weather. When Thomas arrived at his flat, a modest one-bedroom place above a dry cleaner's shop, he found a note that had been pushed under his door. The note was written on plain white paper in a handwriting that Thomas did not recognize. It consisted of just 2 sentences. The first sentence said that Thomas should stop asking questions about things that did not concern him. The second sentence said that continuing to investigate the matter of the cellar would have consequences that Thomas would not enjoy. There was no signature, no return address, and no indication of who had written it or how they had known where Thomas lived. Thomas read the note 3 times, his hands perfectly steady, despite the fact that his heart was hammering in his chest. Then he folded the note carefully, placed it in his notebook alongside his written account of the cellar discovery, and sat down on the edge of his bed to think. The note changed everything, and yet, in a strange way, it changed nothing. It confirmed what Thomas had already suspected, that his discovery in the cellar was connected to something that someone very much wanted to keep hidden. The fact that someone had taken the trouble to find out where he lived and deliver a threatening note told Thomas 2 things. First, that at least one other person knew about the bracelet and its significance. And second, that this person, or persons, were watching him, which meant that his visit to the library had not gone unnoticed. Thomas was not particularly afraid. He had served in the military, had been trained to handle threats both physical and psychological, and had long ago made his peace with the idea that doing the right thing sometimes meant putting yourself in an uncomfortable position. But he was concerned, not for himself so much as for the truth. Because Thomas had always believed that truth was the one thing that should never be sacrificed, no matter how inconvenient or dangerous it might be to pursue. The next morning, Thomas went to work as usual, arriving 15 minutes early, and taking up his position in the East Wing corridor. But instead of going through his normal patrol routine, he walked directly to the security office and knocked on Crawford's door. Crawford was at his desk, as he always was at this hour, and he looked up at Thomas with an expression that was difficult to read. Thomas did not waste time with pleasantries. He told Crawford about the note that had been pushed under his door, about his visit to the library, and about his growing conviction that the bracelet in the cellar was connected to something far more serious than a lost piece of jewelry. He said all of this calmly and clearly, standing at attention as he had been trained to do, and when he was finished, he waited for Crawford to respond. Crawford's response was not what Thomas had expected. The older man did not dismiss Thomas's concerns, nor did he tell him to mind his own business and focus on his duties. Instead, Crawford stood up from his desk, walked to the window, and stood there for a long time, staring out at the palace gardens with his back to Thomas. When he finally turned around, his face had changed. The neutral mask that he always wore had slipped, just slightly, and beneath it Thomas could see something that looked like weariness, like the exhaustion of a man who had been carrying a burden for far too long. Crawford sat back down and told Thomas something that he had not told anyone else. Something that he had kept to himself for 3 years because he had been afraid of the consequences of speaking it aloud. He said that when Charlotte Ashworth had resigned from her position at the palace, he had been the one assigned to handle her departure. He had been the one to collect her security pass, escort her from the building, and ensure that she returned all palace property before she left. But Charlotte had been in such a state of agitation on the day of her departure that Crawford had been unable to complete the standard exit procedures. She had been pale, her hands had been shaking, and she had kept looking over her shoulder, as if she expected someone to appear behind her at any moment. Crawford had asked her if she was all right, and Charlotte had said something that had stayed with him ever since. She had said that she had seen something that she was not supposed to see, and that she needed to leave before the person who had shown it to her realized that she understood what it meant. Crawford had tried to get Charlotte to explain what she was talking about, but she had refused. She had simply shaken her head, handed over her security pass, and walked out of the palace without looking back. Crawford had reported her departure to his superiors as a straightforward resignation, because that was what it appeared to be on paper, and because Charlotte had given him no concrete information that would have justified a formal investigation. But the encounter had troubled him deeply, and when the bracelet was reported missing a few weeks later, Crawford had begun to wonder whether Charlotte's departure and the bracelet's disappearance were connected in ways that he had not initially understood. Thomas listened to Crawford's account with a growing sense that the pieces of a very complex puzzle were beginning to come together, even if the picture they formed was still far from clear. He asked Crawford if he had ever tried to find Charlotte after she left the palace. Crawford said that he had made some discreet inquiries, using contacts he had in the police and in private investigation circles, but that Charlotte had proven remarkably difficult to trace. She had closed her bank accounts, given up the lease on her London flat, and had not used her national insurance number or applied for any form of government benefit since leaving the palace. It was as if she had deliberately erased herself from the official records of her own existence, which was exactly what someone would do if they were afraid of being found by someone with the resources and connections to find almost anyone. Crawford opened the top drawer of his desk and took out the velvet bag containing the bracelet. He placed it on the desk between them and looked at Thomas with an expression that was now openly conflicted. He said that he had spent the past week trying to decide what to do with the bracelet, and that he had reached a decision that went against every rule and regulation he had lived by for the past 20 years. He said that he wanted Thomas to help him investigate the circumstances surrounding Charlotte Ashworth's departure from the palace and the appearance of her bracelet in the cellar. He said that he could not do this through official channels because he did not know who within the palace hierarchy could be trusted and who might be connected to whatever had frightened Charlotte so badly that she had fled her life without taking her most precious possession with her. Thomas felt the weight of what Crawford was asking him settle onto his shoulders like a physical thing. He was being asked to step outside his role, to take risks that could cost him his career and possibly more, and to do so based on nothing more than a broken bracelet, a cryptic conversation from 3 years ago, and a threatening note that had appeared under his door. Any sensible person would have said no. Any person who valued their career, their safety, and their peace of mind would have politely declined Crawford's request and gone back to standing at their post and doing their job. But Thomas was not any person. He was a man who had descended 37 steps into darkness because he could not leave a door unopened. A man who had gone to a library on his day off because he could not leave a question unanswered. And a man who had read a threatening note and felt not fear, but determination. He told Crawford that he would help. Crawford nodded, and something passed between the two men that was more than a professional agreement. It was an understanding, a shared recognition that they were about to embark on something that could have serious consequences for both of them, but that the alternative, which was to do nothing and let the truth remain buried in a damp cellar, was unacceptable to both of them, as men and as guardians of the institution they served. Crawford told Thomas that they would need to be extremely careful in how they proceeded. They could not be seen meeting too often, could not be overheard discussing the matter, and could not leave any written records that might be discovered by the wrong people. Thomas thought of his notebook, with its detailed account of the cellar discovery, and made a mental note to keep it in a safer place than his breast pocket. The first step, Crawford said, was to find Charlotte Ashworth. Without her, they had a broken bracelet and a lot of questions, but no answers. Thomas agreed and asked where they should start looking. Crawford said that he had one lead that he had not yet followed up on. During his initial inquiries into Charlotte's whereabouts, he had spoken with a former colleague of Charlotte's, a woman named Margaret Tully who had worked in the palace housekeeping department at the same time as Charlotte. Margaret had told Crawford that she and Charlotte had been close friends during their time at the palace, and that Charlotte had once mentioned a family cottage in Cornwall where she used to spend holidays as a child. Margaret had not known the exact location of the cottage, but she had remembered that Charlotte spoke of it with a particular fondness, describing it as the one place in the world where she felt truly safe. Cornwall was a large county, and a family cottage with no specific address was not much to go on. But Thomas had been trained in systematic search methods during his military service, and he suggested that they start by checking property records for the Ashworth family in Cornwall. If the cottage existed, there would be a record of it somewhere, a deed, a tax assessment, a utility connection. These things left traces that even the most careful person could not entirely erase. Crawford agreed, and said that he had a contact at the land registry who might be willing to help, provided that the inquiry was handled with the appropriate level of discretion. Thomas left the security office that morning with a sense of purpose that he had not felt in years. His job as a royal guard had given him structure and dignity, but it had also, if he was being honest with himself, become somewhat routine. He had spent years standing at his post, watching the same corridors, patrolling the same grounds, and dealing with the same minor incidents that were the bread and butter of palace security. The discovery in the cellar, and now the investigation that was growing out of it, had awakened something in him that routine had put to sleep. He felt alive in a way that he had not felt since his early days in the military, when every day brought something new and every situation demanded the best of him. Over the next 2 weeks, Thomas and Crawford worked quietly and methodically to follow the trail that Charlotte Ashworth had left behind. Crawford contacted his associate at the land registry, and after several days of searching, they found what they were looking for. A property in a small coastal village in South Cornwall, registered to the Ashworth family since 1967, was still listed as active on the records. The property was a 2-bedroom stone cottage on a hillside overlooking the sea, and according to the records, the council tax was still being paid, though the name on the account was not Charlotte's but rather her late mother Eleanor's. This in itself was interesting, because it suggested that someone was maintaining the cottage and paying its bills, even though Eleanor Ashworth had been dead for 3 years and Charlotte had supposedly vanished from public life. Thomas and Crawford discussed their findings in brief, carefully timed conversations that took place during shift changes and break periods, when the security office was empty and the corridors were quiet. They agreed that the cottage in Cornwall was their best lead, and that someone needed to go there in person to see if Charlotte was living there, or if the property could provide any other clues to her whereabouts. Crawford said that he could not leave the palace without attracting attention, as his absence would be noticed immediately by his superiors. Thomas, on the other hand, had accumulated a significant amount of leave time that he had never used, because he had never had a reason to take a holiday. Crawford suggested that Thomas take a few days off and drive down to Cornwall, presenting the trip as a much-needed break rather than an investigation. Thomas agreed to the plan, but before he left, he wanted to do one more thing. He wanted to go back down to the cellar. Crawford was initially reluctant, concerned that the cellar might be under surveillance or that Thomas's presence there might alert whoever had left the threatening note. But Thomas argued that they needed to know if there was anything else down there that they had missed on the first visit, anything that might help them understand why the bracelet had been left in that particular location. Crawford eventually agreed, on the condition that Thomas go during the early hours of the morning when the palace was at its quietest, and that he be in and out within 15 minutes. Thomas returned to the cellar at 3 o'clock in the morning on a Tuesday, descending the 37 steps once again with his flashlight in his hand and his senses on high alert. The chamber looked exactly as it had when he first found it, unchanged and undisturbed. The dust on the floor still bore the faint scuff marks that he had noticed before, and the damp walls still glistened with moisture in the beam of his flashlight. But this time, Thomas was not looking for a velvet bag. He was looking for anything else that might have been left behind. Any other sign that someone had used this cellar for a purpose beyond its original design. He searched the chamber methodically, starting at one corner and working his way around the walls, examining every crack and crevice in the stone. For the first 10 minutes, he found nothing. The cellar was as empty and featureless as it appeared to be. But then, just as Thomas was about to give up and return to the surface, his flashlight caught something that he had missed on his first visit. In the wall opposite the corner where he had found the velvet bag, there was a loose stone. It was not obviously loose, not something that you would notice unless you were pressing your hands against every stone in the wall, but when Thomas pushed on it, it shifted slightly under his fingers. He worked the stone free with careful, patient movements, and behind it, in a small hollow carved into the thick palace wall, he found a second object. It was an envelope. A plain white envelope, sealed with wax and addressed in a handwriting that Thomas did not recognize, but that he immediately suspected belonged to Charlotte Ashworth. The envelope was damp but intact, and through the paper, Thomas could feel the stiff outlines of what appeared to be a letter or a document of some kind. He resisted the urge to open it there and then, remembering Crawford's instruction to be in and out within 15 minutes. He replaced the stone, tucked the envelope inside his jacket, and climbed back up the 37 steps to the east wing corridor. When he showed the envelope to Crawford the next morning, the older man's face went pale. Crawford recognized the wax seal on the envelope. It was not a common seal, but one that was used exclusively within the palace for internal correspondence of a sensitive nature. The fact that Charlotte had used this seal on a personal letter suggested that she had been trying to send a message, and that the message was one that she had wanted to protect with the authority and secrecy that the seal represented. Crawford and Thomas looked at each other across the desk, the envelope sitting between them like an unexploded bomb, and both men knew that opening it would take them past the point of no return. Crawford broke the seal carefully, trying to preserve it as much as possible, and removed a single sheet of paper from the envelope. The paper was handwritten on both sides in a small, neat script that was clearly Charlotte's, based on comparisons with the palace employment records that Crawford had access to. Thomas watched as Crawford read the letter, and he saw the older man's expression change from concentration to disbelief to something that looked very much like anger. When Crawford finished reading, he placed the letter on the desk and pushed it toward Thomas without saying a word. Thomas picked up the letter and began to read. What he found in those handwritten lines would reshape everything he thought he knew about the palace, about Charlotte Ashworth, and about the people who had the power to make a woman disappear from her own life. The letter was addressed to no one in particular, written as a record rather than a communication, and it began with a simple declaration that sent a wave of shock through Thomas's body. Charlotte wrote that she had discovered evidence of a systematic theft from the royal collection, a theft that had been going on for years and that involved at least 3 members of the palace staff, including one person whose name and position made their involvement almost unthinkable. She wrote that she had stumbled upon the evidence accidentally while carrying out her normal duties, and that the moment she realized what she was looking at, she knew that her life at the palace was over. The letter went on to describe in careful and precise detail how Charlotte had first become suspicious when she noticed discrepancies in the inventory records for certain items in the royal collection. Items that were supposed to be in one location were recorded as being in another, and some items that she knew she had seen with her own eyes were listed as being in storage when they clearly were not. At first, she had assumed that these were simple clerical errors, the kind of mistakes that happen in any large organization dealing with thousands of valuable objects. But when she brought the discrepancies to the attention of her supervisor, she was told sharply to stop looking into the matter and to focus on her own duties. This response struck Charlotte as unusual and disproportionate, and rather than discouraging her, it made her more determined to understand what was going on. Thomas put the letter down and looked at Crawford. Both men sat in silence for a long moment, the full implications of what they had just read slowly sinking in. They were no longer dealing with a lost bracelet or a missing woman. They were dealing with something that, if Charlotte's letter was accurate, represented a serious breach of trust at the heart of one of the most revered institutions in the country. And they were dealing with it alone, without backup, without authority, and without any guarantee that the people they might turn to for help were not already part of the problem. Thomas thought about the threatening note under his door, and for the first time since this whole business began, he felt a genuine sense of danger settling around him like the cold, damp air of the cellar where it all started. Crawford locked the letter in his desk alongside the bracelet, and told Thomas that they needed to move carefully, but quickly. The trip to Cornwall was now more urgent than ever. If Charlotte was alive and in hiding, she was the only person who could confirm the contents of her letter and provide the additional evidence that would be needed to bring the matter to the attention of people who could actually do something about it. Without Charlotte, they had a letter and a bracelet, which were compelling but not conclusive. With Charlotte, they had a witness, and a witness was the one thing that the people behind this conspiracy would fear above all else. Thomas went home that evening and began to pack a small bag for his trip to Cornwall. As he folded his clothes and placed them in his battered old hold-all, he thought about Charlotte Ashworth, sitting alone in a stone cottage on a hillside overlooking the sea, watching the waves crash against the rocks below and wondering whether anyone would ever come looking for her. He thought about the bracelet with her name engraved on it, broken and abandoned in the darkness beneath a palace where she had once worked and been valued, and then, apparently, been betrayed. And he thought about the letter in Crawford's desk, with its careful handwriting and its explosive contents, and he knew that the next few days would determine not just the outcome of their investigation, but the course of his own life in ways that he could not yet imagine. He zipped up his bag, set his alarm for 5 a.m, and lay down on his bed. Sleep came slowly, pursued by thoughts of dark cellars and broken bracelets, and a woman named Charlotte, who had seen something she was not supposed to see and had been running from it ever since. Outside his window, the lights of London glowed against the night sky, indifferent to the small dramas and large conspiracies that played out within its ancient streets. Thomas closed his eyes and tried to quiet his mind, But the last thought that crossed it before sleep finally came was a question that he could not answer. What had Charlotte Ashworth seen that was so terrible that it had driven her from her life, and what would happen when the truth finally came to light? Thomas Hartfield left London before dawn on a Thursday morning, driving his aging Ford Escort down the M4 motorway with a thermos of tea on the passenger seat and the weight of Charlotte Ashworth's story pressing on his mind like a stone. The roads were mostly empty at that hour, just a scattering of lorries making their early deliveries, and the occasional commuter getting a head start on the day. Thomas drove with the steady, unhurried pace of a man who had learned patience through years of standing still. And as the city gradually gave way to the open countryside, he felt the tension in his shoulders begin to ease for the first time in weeks. The drive from London to South Cornwall was roughly 5 hours, and Thomas used the time to organise his thoughts. He replayed everything he knew about Charlotte Ashworth, starting with the moment he had pushed open that heavy wooden door in the East Wing corridor and ending with the letter that Crawford had read aloud in the security office. The letter had described a theft from the Royal Collection, a systematic and carefully disguised operation that had been going on for years under the noses of everyone who was supposed to be safeguarding those treasures. Charlotte had written about inventory discrepancies, about items that were recorded as being in places where they clearly were not, and about a supervisor who had warned her off when she tried to bring the matter to official attention. But the letter had also contained something more personal, something that Thomas kept returning to as the miles slipped past outside his window. Charlotte had written about her bracelet. She had described it as a gift from her grandmother, a woman who had worked in service to wealthy families for most of her life and who had been given the bracelet by her employer as a token of appreciation for decades of faithful work. The bracelet was Charlotte's most treasured possession, the one physical connection she had to a grandmother who had died when Charlotte was 16. Charlotte wrote that she had left the bracelet in the cellar deliberately, hidden in the velvet bag, because she was afraid that if she tried to take it with her when she left the palace, it would be found during the exit search and used as evidence that she was the thief rather than the person trying to expose the theft. She had hidden it there with the intention of coming back for it when things had settled down, when the truth had come out and the real thieves had been caught and punished. But things had not settled down, and the truth had not come out, and Charlotte had never been able to return for the one thing she loved most in the world. That detail, more than anything else in the letter, had made Thomas's chest tighten with an emotion he could not quite name. It was not pity, because Charlotte did not seem like a woman who would want pity. It was more like recognition, the recognition of someone who understood what it meant to have one precious thing in your life and to be forced to leave it behind. Thomas's own precious thing was not a bracelet, but a sense of duty, a belief that doing the right thing mattered even when it was difficult and dangerous. That belief was what had sent him down 37 steps into a dark cellar, and it was what was now driving him down the M4 toward a small village in Cornwall where a woman might or might not be waiting to be found. Thomas crossed into Cornwall in the late morning, passing through towns with names that sounded like they belonged in storybooks rather than on road signs. The landscape changed as he drove further south and west, becoming wilder and more dramatic with each passing mile. The flat, tidy fields of the English Midlands gave way to rolling hills covered in gorse and heather, and in the distance, Thomas could see the grey shimmer of the sea stretching out to the horizon. The air coming through his car window was different here, cleaner and sharper, with a salt tang that made him think of holidays he had never taken and places he had never been. The village he was looking for was called Trevian, a name that Thomas had found in the land registry records alongside the Ashworth family's cottage listing. It was a tiny place, barely more than a cluster of houses gathered around a small harbour where fishing boats rocked gently on the incoming tide. Thomas drove through the village slowly, taking in the narrow lanes, the whitewashed walls, and the general air of a place that existed at its own pace, unconcerned with the urgency and ambition that drove the world beyond its borders. He parked his car near the harbour and got out, stretching his legs and breathing in the sea air. A few local people glanced at him with the polite curiosity that strangers always attract in small communities, but no one approached him or asked what he was doing there. Thomas had decided not to ask anyone in the village directly about Charlotte Ashworth, at least not at first. If Charlotte was hiding here, she would have taken precautions to protect her privacy, and a stranger asking questions about her would almost certainly get back to her before Thomas had a chance to find her himself. Instead, he planned to locate the cottage using the address from the land registry records and approach it on foot, hoping that a quiet, non-threatening arrival would give him the best chance of making contact. The address listed the cottage as being on a road called Cliff Lane, which Thomas found easily enough by following the main road out of the village and up a steep hill that overlooked the harbour on one side and the open sea on the other. Cliff Lane was not really a lane at all, but a narrow track of packed earth and gravel that wound along the top of the cliff for about half a mile before ending at a wooden gate. Beyond the gate, Thomas could see a small stone cottage sitting in a patch of rough garden, its walls weathered to a soft grey by years of wind and rain. The cottage had a slate roof, a single chimney from which a thin wisp of smoke was rising, and windows that were small and deep-set in the thick stone walls. It looked exactly like the kind of place that a person who wanted to disappear from the world would choose, tucked away on the edge of a cliff at the end of a track that most people would never bother to walk down. Thomas stood at the gate for a moment, looking at the cottage and the thin thread of smoke rising from its chimney, and felt a sudden and unexpected nervousness. He had faced many difficult situations in his life, had stood firm under pressure in the military, and had dealt calmly with security threats at the palace. But this was different. He was about to knock on the door of a woman who had been living in hiding for 3 years, a woman who had fled her life because she had stumbled upon a secret that powerful people wanted to keep buried. He had no official authority to be here, no badge to show, and no guarantee that Charlotte would be willing to talk to him even if she was behind that door. All he had was a broken bracelet in a velvet bag, which Crawford had given him to take on the trip as proof that he was telling the truth, and a belief that Charlotte deserved to know that someone had found her message and was willing to help. Thomas opened the gate and walked up the short path to the cottage door. The garden on either side of the path was wild and overgrown, with tall grass and wildflowers growing in tangled clumps alongside what might once have been neat beds of herbs and vegetables. A fat tabby cat sat on the stone step by the door, watching Thomas approach with the lazy indifference of an animal that has no particular opinions about strangers. Thomas stepped over the cat and raised his hand to knock on the door. Before his knuckles could make contact with the wood, the door opened, and Thomas found himself face to face with Charlotte Ashworth. She was older than the photograph in the Society magazine, of course, and the years of hiding had left their mark on her face. The high cheekbones were still there, but the skin stretched over them was thinner and more drawn, and there were lines around her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and constant worry. Her dark hair, which had been pulled back neatly in the photograph, was now loose and streaked with grey, falling to her shoulders in waves that the sea wind had tangled. She was wearing a plain woolen jumper and a pair of old jeans, and her feet were bare on the stone floor of the cottage doorway. But her eyes were exactly as Thomas had imagined them from the photograph, sharp and intelligent and watchful, taking in every detail of his appearance in a single glance that lasted less than a second, but that seemed to weigh and measure everything about him. Charlotte did not speak at first. She simply stood in the doorway and looked at Thomas with an expression that was part suspicion, part resignation, and part something else that Thomas could not immediately identify, but that he would later recognize as relief. She looked at him the way a person looks at something they have been expecting for a long time, something they have both hoped for and dreaded in equal measure. Thomas introduced himself. He told Charlotte his name, his position at Kensington Palace, and the reason he had come to Cornwall. He told her about finding the door in the east wing corridor, about descending the stairs to the cellar, and about discovering the velvet bag with her bracelet inside. He told her about the letter hidden behind the loose stone, and about Sergeant Crawford's decision to investigate the matter privately rather than through official channels. He said all of this standing on the cottage doorstep, with the sea wind blowing around him and the tabby cat weaving between his ankles, and when he was finished, he reached into his jacket pocket and took out the velvet bag. Charlotte stared at the velvet bag in Thomas's hand, and something changed in her face. The suspicion and the wariness did not disappear entirely, but they were joined by an emotion that was too raw and too deep to be hidden behind any mask of composure. Her eyes filled with tears, not the dramatic tears of someone performing grief for an audience, but the quiet, involuntary tears of a person who has been carrying a weight alone for so long that the mere sight of someone offering to help is enough to break through every defense they have built. She reached out and took the velvet bag from Thomas's hand, her fingers trembling as they closed around the familiar shape of the bracelet through the damp velvet. She held it against her chest for a moment, her eyes closed, and Thomas saw her lips move in what might have been a prayer or a thank you, or simply the repetition of a name that only she could hear. Then Charlotte opened her eyes, stepped back from the doorway, and invited Thomas into the cottage. The inside was small but comfortable, with low ceilings, thick stone walls, and the kind of warmth that comes from a fire that has been burning steadily all morning. The furniture was old and mismatched, but well cared for, and every surface seemed to hold either a book, a plant, or a piece of sea glass that Charlotte had apparently collected from the beach below the cliffs. Thomas sat down in an armchair by the fire, and Charlotte went to the kitchen to make tea, moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been living alone for a long time, and who had found a rhythm to her solitary days that brought her a measure of peace, if not happiness. When she returned with 2 mugs of tea, Charlotte sat down across from Thomas and began to tell her story. She spoke quietly but clearly, and Thomas could see that she had been over these events in her mind so many times that she could recount them with the precision of someone reading from a well-rehearsed script. But there was nothing mechanical about the way she spoke. Every word carried the weight of lived experience, and every pause was filled with the memory of emotions that time had softened but not erased. Charlotte told Thomas that she had come to work at Kensington Palace in 1991, at the age of 28. After being recommended for the position by a family friend who had connections within the royal household, she had been thrilled by the opportunity, had thrown herself into her work with an enthusiasm that her supervisors had noticed and rewarded, and had quickly risen through the ranks to become one of the most trusted members of the household staff. Her responsibilities had been broad, encompassing everything from managing the schedules of certain rooms and their contents to overseeing the care and maintenance of specific items in the royal collection. It was this last responsibility, the care of the collection, that had ultimately led to her downfall. Charlotte explained that the royal collection was vast, far larger and more diverse than most people realized. It included not just the famous paintings and jewels that tourists came to see, but also thousands of smaller items, decorative objects, historical artifacts, personal effects of past monarchs, pieces of furniture, silverware, porcelain, and countless other things that had accumulated over centuries of royal life. Managing such a collection required meticulous record-keeping, and Charlotte had been responsible for maintaining and updating the inventory records for a section of the collection that included jewelry, small decorative objects, and personal artifacts. It was during a routine inventory check, in the spring of 1992, that Charlotte first noticed something was wrong. She was comparing the current inventory against a master list that was supposed to be updated monthly, and she found that 3 items listed as being in a particular display case were not actually there. The items were relatively small: a gold snuff box from the 18th century, a pair of silver candlesticks from the early Victorian period, and a jeweled brooch that had reportedly belonged to a minor member of the royal family in the 19th century. Charlotte checked the records and found that all 3 items were listed as having been moved to storage for conservation work, but when she checked with the conservation department, they had no record of receiving any of the 3 items. There was a gap in the records, a place where the items had simply ceased to exist on paper without any corresponding entry to explain where they had gone. Charlotte was puzzled but not immediately alarmed. Errors in record-keeping were not unheard of in such a large and complex collection, and she assumed that someone had simply forgotten to update the paperwork when the items were moved. She mentioned the discrepancies to her supervisor, a man whose name she did not want to give to Thomas at this stage, and asked him to help her trace the missing items so that the records could be corrected. Her supervisor's reaction had been the first sign that something was genuinely wrong. Instead of thanking Charlotte for her diligence or agreeing to help her investigate, he had become visibly angry. He had told Charlotte that the inventory discrepancies were not her concern, that the items had been moved on the authority of someone senior to both of them, and that Charlotte should not mention the matter again to anyone. Charlotte told Thomas that this response had shocked her. In all her years at the palace, she had never been spoken to in such a way, and the sharpness of her supervisor's tone suggested not just annoyance, but fear. People who were simply irritated by a clerical question did not react with that level of intensity. Charlotte had spent the rest of the day going about her normal duties, but her mind kept returning to the missing items, and to her supervisor's inexplicable anger. That evening, after most of the staff had gone home, Charlotte returned to the records room and began a more thorough review of the inventory. What she found over the next several hours confirmed her worst suspicions and set in motion the chain of events that would ultimately drive her from the palace and into hiding. The discrepancies that Charlotte discovered were not limited to the 3 items she had initially noticed. Over a period of approximately 2 years, a total of 17 items had been removed from the section of the collection that Charlotte was responsible for. And in every case, the removal had been disguised by false entries in the inventory records. The false entries followed a consistent pattern. An item would be listed as having been sent to the Conservation Department for repair or cleaning, but the Conservation Department would have no record of receiving it. After a period of time, usually several months, the item would be quietly removed from the inventory altogether, listed as having been transferred to another section of the collection or placed in long-term storage. But Charlotte, who knew the collection intimately, and who had a memory for detail that was almost photographic, knew that these transfers had never taken place. The items had simply been taken, stolen, from under the noses of the people who were supposed to be protecting them, and the records had been altered to cover the theft. The value of the missing items was substantial. Charlotte estimated that the 17 items she had identified were worth, collectively, several £100,000, and she suspected that there were other items missing from other sections of the collection that she had not been responsible for and therefore had not noticed. The theft had been carried out with a sophistication and a knowledge of the palace's security systems and record-keeping procedures that suggested the involvement of someone, or several people, who had intimate access to both. This was not the work of an outsider who had broken in and grabbed whatever they could carry. This was the work of people who knew the collection, who understood how the inventory was managed, and who had the authority to move items and alter records without raising suspicion. Charlotte told Thomas that the discovery had terrified her. She had spent several agonizing days trying to decide what to do, weighing her options and considering the consequences of each possible course of action. She could go to the police, but she had no physical evidence, only her own knowledge of the inventory discrepancies. And she was afraid that the people responsible for the theft would be able to use their positions and connections to discredit her and make her look like the thief instead. She could go to the media, but the idea of exposing the palace to a public scandal was deeply repugnant to Charlotte, who had genuine respect and affection for the institution she served, and who did not want to see it damaged by the actions of a few corrupt individuals. Or she could confront the people she suspected of being involved and try to persuade them to stop and to return the stolen items before the matter went any further. In the end, Charlotte chose none of these options. Instead, she chose to run. She told Thomas that the decision to leave the palace had not been made in a single moment of panic, but had crystallized over several days of careful thought. She had realized that the people involved in the theft were too well placed and too well protected for her to challenge on her own, and that any attempt to expose them would likely result in her own destruction rather than theirs. She had also realized, with a cold clarity that she said had kept her awake at night ever since, that she might be in physical danger. The items that had been stolen were worth a great deal of money, and people who are willing to steal from the royal collection are not likely to stop at theft if they feel threatened. Charlotte described the day of her departure from the palace in a voice that was steady, but tinged with a sadness that 3 years of solitude had not been able to wash away. She had known for several days that she was going to leave, and she had spent those days quietly and methodically putting her affairs in order. She had closed her bank accounts, given notice on her London flat, and packed her belongings into boxes that she had arranged to have shipped to the cottage in Cornwall. She had written the letter that Thomas and Crawford had found behind the loose stone, detailing everything she knew about the theft and the people she suspected of being involved. And she had hidden it in the cellar in the hope that someday someone would find it and understand what had happened. The bracelet had been the hardest thing to leave behind. Charlotte told Thomas that she had stood in the cellar for nearly 10 minutes, holding the velvet bag in her hands and trying to make herself put it down. The bracelet was the last connection she had to her grandmother, a woman who had taught Charlotte that integrity was more important than comfort, and that doing the right thing was its own reward, even when the cost was high. Leaving the bracelet in the cellar felt like leaving a piece of herself behind, a piece that she was not sure she could ever get back. But she also knew that the bracelet might one day serve as evidence, a physical link between herself and the cellar and the letter, something that could not be explained away or denied by the people who wanted to keep the truth hidden. So she had placed the velvet bag on the cold stone floor, turned around, and climbed the 37 steps for the last time. Thomas listened to Charlotte's account without interrupting, his tea growing cold in his hands and the fire in the grate burning down to embers. When she finished, there was a long silence in the cottage, broken only by the sound of the wind outside and the distant crash of waves against the rocks at the base of the cliff. Thomas looked at Charlotte and saw not a woman who had been defeated by her circumstances, but a woman who had made an impossible choice and had lived with its consequences every day for 3 years. She had not run because she was a coward. She had run because she was alone, because the system she had trusted had failed her, and because the people she should have been able to turn to for help were the very people she needed to be protected from. Thomas told Charlotte about the threatening note that had been pushed under his door. He watched her face carefully as he described it, and he saw her expression tighten with a recognition that confirmed what he had suspected. "Tom said—" Charlotte said that she was not surprised. She said that the people behind the theft had resources and connections that extended far beyond the palace walls, and that they were the kind of people who did not make threats idly. She said that Thomas and Crawford needed to be very careful about how they proceeded, because the people they were dealing with had already demonstrated a willingness to do whatever was necessary to protect themselves, and the discovery of the bracelet and the letter would have made them more dangerous, not less. Thomas asked Charlotte if she would be willing to come forward to tell a story to someone in authority who could actually investigate the theft and hold the people responsible accountable. Charlotte was silent for a long time, staring into the dying fire with an expression that Thomas could not read. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but firm. She said that she had spent 3 years waiting for someone to find her letter and her bracelet, waiting for someone to come looking for her and offer her the one thing that she could not give herself, which was the assurance that she would not be alone in this fight. She said that Thomas's arrival at her door was either an answer to a prayer she had stopped believing in, or the beginning of a disaster that would consume them both. She did not know which it was, and she was afraid to find out. But she also said that she was tired of hiding, tired of being afraid, tired of living with the knowledge that something terribly wrong had happened, and that she had done nothing to stop it beyond writing a letter and hiding it in a cellar. She said that if Thomas and Crawford could find a way to bring the matter to the attention of someone who had both the power and the integrity to act on it, she would be willing to tell her story, to provide whatever evidence she could, and to face whatever consequences came from doing so. She said this with the quiet determination of a woman who had made her peace with the idea that the truth was worth more than her safety, and Thomas felt a surge of respect for her that bordered on admiration. They talked for several more hours, going over the details of Charlotte's account and discussing the practical steps that would need to be taken to move the investigation forward. Charlotte provided Thomas with additional information about the items that had been stolen, including descriptions, estimated values, and the dates on which they had been removed from the collection. She also gave Thomas the names of the people she suspected of being involved, names that Thomas committed to memory rather than writing down, because he was now acutely aware that written records could be found by the wrong people. As the afternoon wore on and the light outside began to fade, Thomas realized that he needed to make a decision about what to do next. He could not stay in Cornwall indefinitely, and the longer he was away from the palace, the more likely it was that his absence would attract attention from the very people he was trying to investigate. But he also did not want to leave Charlotte alone and unprotected, knowing that if the people behind the theft learned that she had been found and was willing to talk, her safety could be in serious jeopardy. Charlotte solved this dilemma for him by telling him something that she had not mentioned earlier. She said that she was not entirely without resources or allies. During her years at the palace, she had formed a friendship with a retired police detective named Harold Finch, a man who had spent 30 years investigating art theft and fraud, and who had done occasional consulting work for the palace security team. Charlotte had contacted Finch shortly after arriving in Cornwall and had told him in general terms about the situation she had found herself in. Finch had been sympathetic and had offered to help if Charlotte ever decided to come forward, but he had also warned her that exposing a theft from the royal collection would require solid evidence and careful handling to avoid being dismissed or discredited. Thomas felt a wave of relief at the mention of Harold Finch. A retired detective with experience in art theft was exactly the kind of ally they needed. Someone who understood the legal complexities of the situation and who could advise them on how to build a case that would withstand scrutiny. Thomas asked Charlotte for Finch's contact information, and she gave it to him, along with a sealed letter that she asked Thomas to deliver to Finch personally. The letter, she said, contained additional details about the theft that she had not included in the letter hidden in the cellar. Details that she had been reluctant to commit to writing until she was sure they would reach the right person. Thomas left the cottage in the early evening, walking back down Cliff Lane toward the village as the last light of the day painted the sky in shades of orange and purple above the dark silhouette of the sea. He felt different from the man who had driven down from London that morning, changed by everything he had heard and seen and understood during his hours in Charlotte Ashworth's cottage. The story that he had been drawn into was bigger and more complex than he had imagined, but it was also, in a strange way, simpler. At its core, it was a story about right and wrong, about people who had abused a position of trust for personal gain, and about a woman who had tried to stop them and had paid a terrible price for her integrity. Thomas found a small bed and breakfast in the village and checked in for the night, telling the elderly woman at the reception desk that he was on a walking holiday and was planning to explore the coastal paths for a few days. She gave him a room at the back of the house with a view of the harbour, and Thomas sat by the window in the gathering darkness, watching the lights of the fishing boats and thinking about everything that lay ahead. He needed to get back to London, needed to talk to Crawford, needed to contact Harold Finch, and needed to figure out how to bring the truth to light without getting himself, Crawford, or Charlotte destroyed in the process. It was a tall order for a man who had started this whole business as a simple royal guard on a foggy Tuesday morning. But Thomas had never been the kind of man who shrank from a challenge. He had descended 37 steps into darkness and had brought back something that the darkness had been hiding for 3 years. Now he needed to make sure that what he had found was not lost again. Thomas set his alarm for 5 in the morning, just as he always did, and lay down on the narrow bed in the small room above the harbour. The sound of the waves came through the window, steady and rhythmic, like the breathing of the sea itself. Thomas closed his eyes and thought of Charlotte Ashworth, alone in her cottage on the cliff, holding her grandmother's broken bracelet, and wondering if she had made the right decision to trust a stranger who had appeared on her doorstep with a velvet bag and a promise that he would help. Thomas hoped that she had, because the alternative was too bleak to contemplate. The waves continued their endless conversation with the shore, and somewhere in the darkness between waking and sleeping, Thomas made a promise to himself that he would not let Charlotte down. He did not know yet how he would keep that promise, but the making of it was enough, for now, to quiet his mind and let him rest.